In the last section, we refactored our functional app component over to a class-based one. As I've mentioned several times now, just doing this refactor alone is not going to solve the issue that we have with the get current position call taking some amount of time. In this video, we're going to start to introduce the idea of state in React, and that's the actual system that's going to solve this problem that we're running into. Now, regarding this state system in React, I've got some good news for you and some bad news. The good news is that once we understand state, it's really going to open the door in React, and it's going to allow us to easily make really interesting applications as opposed to the somewhat more simplistic ones that we're working on right now. So once we kind of get over this topic, the world is our oyster, and we get to start working on some pretty interesting apps. That's the good news. The bad news is that traditionally working on state and learning how state works is a little bit challenging. Trust me, I've taught many people about React, and without fail, the state system ends up being a little bit challenging. Now, when you're teaching someone a new topic, as I am for you right now, you're not really supposed to tell them that, hey, this thing you're about to learn is really hard. The reason I tell you that it's something challenging is so that you understand that you need to kind of go into these next couple of videos really listening and paying attention. I'm going to be repeating myself a lot in the next couple of videos, the same kind of facts over and over and over about state. And the reason I'm doing that is not because I like to hear myself talk. It's so that you can really start to internalize the ideas around state and really start to develop an intuition around it. Okay, so that's my pep talk. Without further ado, let's actually start talking about state. All right, so we had previously rules of class components. Now we're going to talk about the rules of the state system in React. So I'm going to zoom in here. We're going to talk about each of these items on this list right here very quickly. We'll then take a pause and then write a little bit of code to understand how state works. So first rule of state, only usable with class-based components, which is what we just refactored to inside of our app component. Now I've got this little note over here, tiny little note that I'm only going to mention in very brief passing. Technically, we can use state with functional components using the hook system, which is something that we're going to discuss way later in the course. But trust me, that hook system, my opinion, way more challenging to understand than just using state inside of a class-based component. So for right now, even though this is not like 100% really true, we're just going to accept this as reality because it makes understanding state many times easier. Okay, so next item, you will confuse props with state. And that's a frowny face right there because this is the unfortunate reality. The prop system and the state system, at the end of the day, they are two very different things, but they are very easy to get mixed up. So we're going to, as we go through the next couple of videos, we're going to say over and over what the differences are between state and props. So what is state? After all this discussion, what is state? State is a JavaScript object that contains some amount of data that is relevant to a singular component. In our case, we would have one piece of state or one state property that is relevant to our app component. And that one single piece of state, that one single property that we care about in our app component is the user's current latitude, which we get out of that position object. Think about it. We don't actually care about the entire position object. We don't care about the velocity, I think was in there. There was also like a timestamp, and there was also the longitude. We don't care about those other properties. For our app, the only thing that we care about inside of here is that latitude. That's it. So with the state system, we create a JavaScript object that is going to contain some amount of data that is strictly relevant to our component that we're working on. All right, next item. Updating state or updating properties inside this JavaScript object on a component will cause our component to almost instantly re-render. And that's going to solve one of the issues that we ran into back over here. Remember, we want to somehow show our component on the screen when our application first starts up, and then some number of seconds later, when we get the result of geolocation, we then want to somehow get our component to re-render itself or update the content that is showing on the screen. So the key of getting a component to re-render is to update its state. And that's something that we're going to reference again and again throughout this course. If we want to get a single component to update itself, we will update its state. All right, next item. State must be initialized when a component is first created. So state is going to always contain some amount of information that is relevant to a component, and thus, when we first create the component, we have to initialize our state. So that essentially means that when we create this app component right here, or an instance of this class, we have to initialize the state property. And I'll show you how to do that in great detail in just a moment. But for right now, I just want you to understand that it must be initialized. And now the last item, and this one is probably the most important one. It is so important that I'm going to zoom in on it, and I'm going to delete these other two so you can only see this by itself. The state property, or that state object, can only be updated using the function setState. Now, we don't know what setState is yet. We haven't spoken about it at all, but I'm going to repeat this line to you nonstop, because this is by far the most common error that everyone makes when they start learning React. They try to update their state, and they do it in ways that they are used to doing with JavaScript, which is not the right way to do it. So we don't have a good example of this. We haven't seen what setState is. We haven't even seen an example of state, but I want you to put this in your head. We only update state using the function setState. All right. So going over these points is probably pretty darn confusing without seeing any code or anything like that. So let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next section, we're going to start to implement state into our app component, and that's going to give us a much better idea of what all these different rules mean. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute.